Hello everyone and welcome to the Drydock episode 355. This week the questions are taken from guide 425 on the Cimarron class fleet oilers, the Wednesday video on the MV Crate and Operation Jaywick, and the Friday video on the fate of the tug Forceful. HMS Ford asks, despite her low freeboard, HMS Devastation is not considered to be a monitor. What characteristics are there that qualify her as something other than a monitor? Essentially, three elements. Firstly, most monitors are designed for riverine and coastal work, so for that they need to have a fairly shallow draft. Devastation has a draft of almost 27 feet, so she's definitely not shallow draft by any stretch of the imagination. And yes, I know there are such things as seagoing monitors, but realistically, actual seagoing monitors, as opposed to still needs a tow and might render everybody almost comatose with seasickness, but technically won't sink at sea monitors, are really something that's only developed towards the very end of the 19th century. Another element is that, partly in service to getting minimum possible displacement and therefore minimum possible draft, the vast majority of monitors carry, at least for 19th century monitors, will be carrying a turret or turrets and maybe a funnel and a small conning tower, but other than that, minimal to no superstructure. Whereas, as you can see with the Devastation, there's a fairly substantial amount of superstructure going on there. And finally, and again, this kind of again ties into the need for minimum draft on actual monitors, when you look at even the bigger late 1860s monitors of the US Navy, their side armour is actually relatively minimal by ironclad standards, certainly by the mid to late 1860s, simply because their freeboard is incredibly low, mostly to save weight and reduce their target profile. And while Devastation's freeboard is low for her overall size, if you, for example, look at this photo, you can see some men on deck. She actually still has a kind of a 5.5, 6 foot plus freeboard, depending on where it is along the line of the ship you are, which is considerably more than basically any American Civil War era or immediately post-American Civil War era monitor, which is the period that Devastation comes from, just immediately post the American Civil War. And as a result of that, not only is she far more designed for seagoing duty as a primary operational role, but she also carries a substantial armour belt to repel firepower, because it's expected that she is going to take considerable hits on her side if she gets into combat, whereas, as I said, with monitors, they're designed to be so low profile that if they're taking hits anywhere, it's going to be the turrets, and thus that's where you find the majority of a monitor's armour. Unausprechlicher Benutzernamen asks, warships at tropical anchorages are often photographed with large awnings covering their ends. How is the deck space below the awnings used, and are there cases that probably would not have been considered if awnings were not available or not deployed? Well, you can see here both HMS Cornwall and HMS Hermes out in the tropics. I believe they're on the China station in this photo. And you can see Cornwall has fore and aft awnings rigged, and actually so does Hermes, if you look very carefully, fore and aft of the island. Now, obviously, these are in place for peacetime and almost always at anchor. Very rarely will you see these awnings in place while the ship is actually moving, in part because, well, if let's say Cornwall picks up to 22 knots, that's a fairly substantial wind going over the deck, even assuming there isn't any other wind, and, well, these things would make fairly good sails and disappear off into the sea. But you can manoeuvre at low speeds and your awnings won't rip away. But essentially, the awnings are just there so that everybody doesn't die of heat stroke. When you see ships underway, they will sometimes be underway with their aft awnings still in place, but the fore ones are almost always taken down. The reason for the awnings, it's not for any particular special use. As I said, it's just to stop people baking, because a lot of ships don't have air conditioning in the time period you see this. And although one of the useful functions of a teak deck is to act as insulation for the rest of the ship to stop heat getting in, or if you're in the North Sea, getting out. If you're in a very tropical climate, it's not necessarily going to be as effective as you'd want, and it could potentially then turn your ship into a little bit of a hothouse. So the awnings shade the deck, therefore cutting the amount of heat transferred to the deck, therefore cooling the rest of the ship. And also, as anybody who's been on a tropical cruise, either as a civilian or in the military, will know, if you're out on deck on a ship for an extended period of time in a very hot, sunny environment, you not only have to deal with the glare of the sun coming down, and salt spray and stuff doesn't help with that, but you've also got to deal with reflected light coming up off the water. And between all that, you can get some really nasty sunburn. So just sheltering the crew is a way of making sure that you don't have horrific cases of sunburn amongst your crew while they go about their jobs, especially, of course, if you're, a Royal Navy ship. And let's face it, us Brits, not really usually built for the sun, especially if you're somewhere like Singapore or Hong Kong. But it also serves as a rather useful rain cover, when you get tropical rainstorms and so forth. And so when ships are hosting events and such like, the awnings might go up anyway, whether you're in the tropics or not in the tropics, because if there is then a sudden downpour, you don't have to worry about everything getting soaked. Brendan Buersdorf asks, how many roles can a single ship take on before it becomes too much? At what point, in your opinion, is it better to just have specific types of ship for each role? For example, I was trying to design a fleet escort that could perform the role of minesweeper, minelayer, torpedo net tender, anti-aircraft support vessel, and anti-submarine escort, all on a hull roughly comparable in size to a large sloop, at around 1,300 tons. But as I finished this design, that's when my question came to mind. Well, how many roles can vary quite a bit. Essentially, what you need to do as a baseline is to consider, what is my ship's primary role? And what capabilities, both in terms of positive capabilities and sacrifices to other capabilities, are involved with that. Then, if I want to add additional roles to that ship, which roles am I adding and how do they affect those core capabilities? Because if you can find other roles that don't necessarily affect those core capabilities, or which might either enhance them or only require a little bit of a change, then you can just add quite a few. Whereas if you're looking at something that is essentially mutually exclusive with one of those other key core capabilities, then you're on a bit of a hiding to nothing. So, for example, take a battleship, at least before the Dreadnought, because when you get to the Dreadnought period, everybody's collecting their fleets together at home because there are so few Dreadnoughts relative to previous battleships and so forth. So looking at, let's say, the pre-Dreadnought and Ironclad period, and look at your battleship. Well, what is your battleship's primary job? To be in the battle line. So it doesn't have to be particularly swift, but have a reasonable, pace. It has to be heavily protected, heavily armed, and it has to be able to go a reasonable distance. Those are your core basic capabilities. Now, if you want to use it as a station flagship for a distant overseas colonial outpost, well, what are the capabilities that are required there? It needs to look big and impressive. Okay, battleship does that. Does it have to go particularly fast? Maybe, but maybe not, because it's acting as much as a deterrent as anything else. So, battleship as foreign station flagship, potentially a role. Although, if you do think that it's more likely that that area you might actually need to hunt down enemy raiders, then perhaps you want to use an armoured cruiser, because that also ticks the big and impressive box, but has more speed. And then, of course, you've got, as you can see here, the destroyer. So the destroyer, in its core role, is there to stop other destroyers and torpedo boats from getting to your fleet. So it needs to have a comparable and relatively heavy gun armament. It needs its own torpedoes to strike back. and it needs to be pretty fast and agile, and it's got to have a reasonable range. It's a small ship, so it's not expected to have a massive range, but it's got to have a reasonable range, and it's got to be able to keep up with the fleet, so, decent speed. Great, so what other roles are you assigning it? Fleet Scout? Yeah, it can do that. It's fast, it's low profile, and whatever it runs into, it can at least worry them between its guns and its torpedoes. But then you're perhaps assigning it a fleet attack, fast attack on enemy ships. Well, that's what it's got torpedoes for. That's fine. Convoy escort can be done. I mean, they're relatively speaking smaller and cheaper than cruisers and destroyers. Quick, speed is good for hunting down enemy subs. They've definitely got the gun armament to take on an enemy sub in a surface engagement. Most destroyers usually have depth charges and sonar or ASDIC, so, that's fine. But the usually somewhat limited range and usually the predisposition for high speed, which will affect both the power plant, its most efficient cruising speed, and the hull form, not necessarily built for long-distance, slow-speed cruising with a convoy. So maybe a dedicated convoy escort is better, but it can still do the job, albeit imperfectly. But, for example, ask it to go in the battle line, it doesn't have any armour, and for the most part, when you have full destroyers around, battleship guns significantly outrange most torpedoes, so that's a role it can't fulfill. So looking at your idea for a large sloop around 1,300 tons and the different roles you're going to want it to play, well, minesweeper and minelayer are actually often roles that are done by similar ships when they're in a dedicated form. The only problem you might have is that if you're going for 1,300 tons, it's not going to be a particularly large vessel, so you're not going to be able to fit as many mines on board as a larger dedicated mine layer. But if it's 1,300 tons, you could potentially build a lot of them, so that's not necessarily too much of a problem. Torpedo net tender, well, that involves basically carrying things and moving them around in a harbour environment. Minesweeper, minelayer, torpedo net tender, there's no real conflict between these roles. Anti-aircraft support vessel and anti-sub escort, as well as a fleet escort, this is where you might start to run into problems, because minesweepers and minelayers, generally speaking, need to have a relatively shallow draft, and they need to be pretty handy and efficient at low-speed operations. Torpedo net tender is usually a low-speed operation as well, so that fits. Anti-aircraft support vessel depends where you are. If you're talking about an anti-aircraft support vessel for a convoy or for a base, then again, low-speed maneuvering, not a problem. Although you are going at 1,300 tons, you're going to have to make some interesting decisions about where you're putting your guns, because mine sweeping, mine laying, tending torpedo nets, that means you're going to need a relatively clear aft deck for that equipment, so you're not going to have too much back there. So if you're going to have anti-aircraft guns, you're probably looking at your heavier guns being up front, maybe an amidships gun, which has a good aft fire arc, but all your anti-aircraft firepower is probably going to need to be forward and amidships, maybe a couple of light guns like 20 mils right aft, but you will need that rear deck space quite clear. Anti-sub escort, well, mines, depth charges, doesn't make much odds. Again, space on the back, useful. However, and again, low-speed maneuvering, good for hunting subs that are underwater, but an anti-submarine escort will need a lot of range, which minesweeper, minelayer, torpedo net tender, anti-aircraft support vessel don't necessarily need. So you are going to have to make sure your hull has a decent range and decent performance. Although if you're optimized for low-speed operations and maneuver, then keeping up with a convoy, not necessarily a problem. You might, however, run into either top speed limitations or efficiency limitations when it comes to chasing down submarines on the surface. A bit like the Flower-class corvettes experience. They were a bit faster than the convoys, so keeping up with the convoys wasn't a problem, But when it came to hunting subs, if the subs surfaced out of gun range and made a run for it, there wasn't really a huge amount they could do, which was one of the reasons frigates came in. Fleet escort is now your big problem, because most of these other roles, a longish range hull, like a sloop, could do. But if you want it to do fleet escort, that means you're going to have to keep up with the fleet. And that could be a problem, because let's say your ship is capable of 20 knots, give or take. That's enough, along with a decent range, to fulfill all the other roles. But a fleet escort, whose maximum speed is 20 knots, and which is optimized for probably low-speed operation, so 8 to 12 knots, possibly less, is going to, A, struggle to keep up with the fleet if it's proceeding at pace, and B, probably going to burn through a lot of fuel very quickly. So you may have some significant problems with that one. And if you make it fast enough, so you configure the hull and the propulsion plant to allow you to run at, say, 26 to 28 knots, well, that'll be enough to keep up with the fleet in anything other than battle conditions. But to be fair, you probably don't want this ship in straight-up fleet battle anyway, so that's not necessarily a problem. But the amount of fuel you need and the configuration of the machinery that you'd need to go a long range at those higher speeds would be the direct antithesis of efficient low-speed operations. At which point your fleet escort role, I would suggest, is probably maybe you'd aim for 22 to 24 knots top speed, sacrifice a little bit of your lower speed capability, and then you'd be useful for escorting the fleet at cruise. But when it came to any kind of significant ops, you'd have to fall back to doing something like escorting the logistics train that's following the fleet rather than escorting the fleet itself, which might not necessarily be a problem because that's what destroyers are for after all, but you would have to be prepared to lose that firepower. So within the scope of what you've outlined, I think you could do everything apart from the fleet escort role pretty well, and the more and more compromises you make towards being a full fleet escort, the less you're going to be able to do the other roles efficiently. MGRINZ Cordelia asks, sometimes I struggle to see the difference between classes of ships of the line, as compared to difference in classes in the Age of Steam and Steel, which are very obvious. For example, the Sandwich and London classes. They're a few years apart, very similar in armament and size, so what could the actual differences be between them? Yeah, Age of Sail ship of the line classes can be a little bit more difficult at times, so you really have to look into the finer details. As you mentioned, the two classes are a little bit different size-wise. The London class is just that little bit larger, displaces that little bit more, and admittedly, sometimes the single biggest difference between the designs is, well, time. If they build a run of ships and then 20 years later they build another run of ships to a very slightly different design, they're going to call them different classes. However, there are a few other small differences between, for example, the Sandwich and the London class. So the Sandwich class is essentially taking an older second-rate ship of the line 90-gun design and just stretching it a bit to include some additional gun ports, because they're shifting from counting second-rate armament as lower gun deck, middle gun deck, upper gun deck, and quarterdeck to just being the three main gun decks. So they need a few more guns in there. Whereas the London class is not a stretched version, it's designed to that spec right from the get-go, and it has an additional pair of guns on the middle gun deck. So although they notionally both carry 90 guns, although both Sandwich and London types would be upgraded to 98 guns later on, the London class actually carries a little bit more firepower because she has an additional pair of 18-pounders on the middle gun deck. And also, interestingly enough, the London class draws about a foot less water, which might be somewhat important in coastal operations. BK Zhong asks, relative to the displacement of which vessel came out on top, what's the biggest enemy vessel ever sunk by a warship when that warship wasn't a minelayer? So I'm going to assume you also don't mean submarines, as in you meaning specifically ships, because of course submarines would make it very, very easy. It would be USS Archerfish because, well, she sank the Shinano, which is a little over 45 times her displacement, assuming that both vessels are on the surface. And I'm also going to assume you mean full-rated warships, because if you want to go by purely a surface vessel, then, well, Sven Istvan being sunk by Mars 15, Mars 15 is outmassed by at least 800 times by the Sven Istvan, in which case the winner, if you want to call it that, is going to be the ship you've been seeing on your screen thus far, SMS Pommern, because the destroyer Onslaught, which torpedoed her, and that caused her to explode with all hands going down with the ship, was about 14 times smaller than the Pommern was by displacement. Gustav Lindström asks, why didn't Germany get any of their submarines out of the Mediterranean Sea? Sure, Gibraltar was an issue, but boats had managed to sneak in. Surely one or two could have snuck back out again, or was Allied coverage of the Gibraltar Straits just that good? Well, one U-boat did make it back out, but it was a U-boat that basically dipped in and came out of the Mediterranean way back at the very, very, very start of the war. The fundamental problem with trying to get out of the Mediterranean is twofold. Firstly, as long as there were U-boats in the Med, there were Allied targets to go after, so there wasn't particularly pressing desire to bring them back out. And even after the Italians put in for an armistice, there was still German-held territory in the northern areas and plenty of Allied ships to go after. But even if they wanted to bring U-boats out, which, let's face it, they might want to do in the latter stages, the bigger problem is the underwater endurance of U-boats relative to the Strait of Gibraltar. So if you're on the surface, then there is a current running from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, and U-boats would use this to help boost their speed and do a passage at night. Now, of course, on the surface, if you're running a reasonable old clip, a U-boat might be doing 15, 16, 17 knots, and with the help of the current might even be pushing a sort of a ground speed, if you like, of about 20. And 20 knots at night, during the hours of darkness, you can clear a fair old distance. So you can surface well to the west of the Straits of Gibraltar, and you could be well to the east of the Straits by dawn. And at that point, obviously, you can then dive. And if you're not far enough out, because obviously you've still got what's known as the Alboran Sea, the area just to the east of Gibraltar, which is confined between the southern coast of Spain and the northern coast of Africa before you enter the Mediterranean proper, you could still just chill out underwater and make another surface run at night to get into the Med proper. However, if you try and make the run west at night, i.e. heading out of the Mediterranean, you're going against the current. So suddenly you're going to find your speed drop to 10, 12 knots probably. And that's not far enough. That's not fast enough to get you out of the Straits and beyond the range of Allied air cover before dawn. And it leaves you in a pretty narrow search radius. And of course, you're again coming in via the Alboran Sea, so you're in a very confined area for quite a bit of your run in. Now, there is a current that goes westwards from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, but that's the deep water current. So you might think, okay, well, that's fine. We'll just dive anyway, and we can transit at any time. The problem with that is that, yes, there's a current, but you've got to remember that a U-boat's submerged top speed is only about 7 or 8 knots usually, maybe 9 on some of the faster ones, but they don't have a lot of endurance at that top speed. They're usually, if you want to go distance-wise, they're usually cited maximum ranges around 80 nautical miles, 90, 95 statute miles, if you're running underwater. And if you're doing that, you're running at quite a low speed, 4 or 5 knots. Now, with the current, that might boost you up to 6 or 7 knots maybe, but even so, even if you're maybe able to cover 100, 110 miles, statute miles that is, by running with the current, you've got to dive less than 50 miles off the east end of Gibraltar, and you're going to run out of battery and be forced to surface about 50 miles to the west of Gibraltar, both of which areas are easily inside Allied air spotting range. And of course, you've got to transit on the surface before that to charge your batteries. And when you run out of battery, obviously you've got to surface again to recharge again. And you're just hideously, hideously vulnerable, which means you'll probably be detected and sunk before you get a chance to even try to make the passage. And if you did try and make the passage, well, there's plenty of both passive and active sonar and patrol craft at Gibraltar and in the Straits that they almost certainly will just see where you're going and go, okay, well, we'll have some patrols out to the west waiting for them to run out of battery and pop up, and that'll be the end of you. Especially when you consider that by the time anyone would really have been thinking of pulling U-boats out of the Med, it's going to be later on in the war, so Allied technology in terms of radar and sonar and so forth is considerably more advanced. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, you mention Muntz Metal as an alternative to anti-fouling paint for the MV Crate. When was it discovered, and if it was retroactively available to the people in the Ironclad era, would it have worked with iron? Sadly not, because Muntz Metal was already available to shipbuilders in the Ironclad era because it was made publicly available in the late 1830s and early 1840s as an alternative to copper sheathing, mainly because it was a, roughly speaking, 60-40 mix of copper and zinc, which at the prices of the 19th century in terms of metal made it considerably cheaper than just using pure copper sheeting. And therefore it was, quite attractive for small craft and craft in general. The reason there's a picture of the Cutty Sark is because the Cutty Sark was one of the ships that was sheathed in Muntz Metal. However, unfortunately, of course, being about 60% copper, it still would have had a horrific electrolytic reaction with iron, and so whether you were using copper or Muntz Metal, if you had an iron hull, you would still have need to have done the wood sheathing technique, which some ironclads did, to avoid having your hull eaten away by electrolysis with the salt water. Lon Johnson asks, in the movie The Guns of Navarone, the eponymous guns are absurdly large. Did anything like that actually exist in the Mediterranean? And if they did, were they ever fired in anger? We see a destroyer get straddled by a salvo from the guns. Given the size of the shells, would the straddled destroyer have taken some damage from near misses? There were some fairly large guns in the Mediterranean on the Axis side of things, but the vast majority of them, in terms of shore-based guns, would have been French coastal batteries or coastal batteries that in southern France that the Germans had added to, depending on which coastal battery you're looking at, with a number of them using 340mm or 13 and a bit inch guns from Britannia-class battleships or manufactured for said battleships, because those guns were also used in coast defences by the French at times. But for where the actual action supposedly takes place, I mean, Navarone is a fictional island, but for that general area of the Mediterranean, there weren't any gun batteries of quite the size that you see in the film. Overall, I'd say those guns resemble maybe 11 or 12-inch guns. But there were also some Italian coastal defences that approached that kind of calibre. So yes, there were those kind of guns in the Med, but no, they wouldn't have been, at the eponymous Navarone or any of the islands nearby. In terms of would the shell splashes have potentially caused splinter damage to destroyers, well, you can see my best attempt. I took a screen cap of the bombardment and then dialed up exposure and contrast, etc., so we can see a little bit more clearly what's going on. And although obviously perspective is a little bit difficult to make out, because obviously this is not an actual destroyer being shelled by actual shells, they're not actually shooting at a real ship, you can still roughly estimate what the distance is. And yes, at that range, you could potentially have some splinter damage coming on board the destroyer, which wouldn't be a very good thing. Random Warehouse asks, because carriers didn't work out, would it have been more effective for Germany to disregard V1 and V2 projects and instead hasten the development of guided anti-shipping munitions like the Fritz-X to add a long-range air component to their submarine blockades? It seems like that would compensate for their lack of aircraft carriers for long-range naval strikes and would have had a greater impact than high-tech developments that they focused on in real life. Obviously, there'd still be a risk to the aircraft, but it would be considerably reduced from maritime bombing, which the Germans were already trying, and you'd need fewer aircraft to do so because they'd be more accurate. I wouldn't necessarily concentrate on Fritz-X, because the Fritz-X technically is a glide bomb, sort of, but it's more of a gravity bomb with additional guidance. And also, it's massively overkill if you're going to be using it for enhancing the submarine blockades, like you mentioned. Because, I mean, ultimately, even against full-scale warships, it was kind of overkill against anything that wasn't a battleship. You know, a few cruisers that were hit by Fritz-X survived in large part because the Fritz-X, yes, it punched through their protection, and it punched through the entire ship and went off and exploded underneath, which obviously wasn't great, but it was a lot better than exploding on board, which is obviously what happened to Roma. So, given that the Fritz-X is probably going to be a bit of an embarrassment against merchant ships, because it'll probably just go right through them and a couple of 100 feet in the water before it goes off, and you have to be much more directly above a ship to drop a Fritz-X, I'd say your general principle of focus on guided anti-shipping munitions earlier might be useful, but I'd focus instead on something a bit more like the HS-293, because that can be launched from further away. They're both radio guided, but the 293 is far better equipped for going after unarmoured vessels, which merchant ships, of course, are. But you would have faced a few uphill challenges. Firstly, aircraft capable of carrying one or more HS-293s any significant range would be in relatively short supply the earlier you develop it. Obviously, the later on you get more aircraft like HE-177s and such like, which would help, but initially you'd probably be restricted to things like FW-200s, and there just aren't that many of them. Another problem is if you actually look at the ranges of an HE-177 or an FW-200, scouting ranges, or ranges with a small bomb load, great, fantastic. Ranges carrying 2 or 3 HS-293s, however, and suddenly the range drops off quite considerably. And it's all well and good, you know, flying against targets in the Channel, targets in the Bay of Biscay, even targets in the Mediterranean. They are within your operational range quite easily. But if you're going to be going after targets to help enforce the submarine blockade, i.e. Atlantic convoys, you're only looking at about 600 to 700 miles of operational radius. Now, bearing in mind that's different from range, because range is sometimes cited, that is like, I can go X number of miles. Great, fantastic. You've also got to get back again. So once you account for all the various allowances for operational range, you are looking at about a 600 to 700 mile operational range from all the data I've been able to find for the bigger German aircraft carrying 2 or 3 HS-293s. And then when you look at where you would actually be launching these operations from, pretty much the only place that makes sense is launching them from the western end of Brittany around Brest, because if you launch them from further south and the middle part of the Bay of Biscay, you're adding distance before you clear the Bay of Biscay, at which point your actual operational hunting area is significantly reduced. But if you launch from the northwestern tip of France, you're going to face the problem of, well, Beaufighters and Mosquitoes actually having a longer operational radius than you do, and they're only about 150 miles away on the southwestern coast of Britain, so they could quite easily, set up fighter patrols just a little bit beyond fighter escort range from the Luftwaffe, and start picking you off. And then, of course, even if you have an HS-293 being deployed in, let's say, 1942, that's not mentioning Allied efforts to jam the thing, which, as and when they take effect, is going to massively diminish their capability. And even things like catapult-armed merchantmen, merchant aircraft carriers, and escort carriers, because, of course, the aircraft carrier component of that, they can launch fighters to chase you off, and even if they don't shoot the bomber down, even the HS-293 needs the bomber to kind of parallel it to guide it in. So if a fighter can force you to break off, then you're not going to have control of the missile anymore, which is, that's at least a win for the Allies because you didn't hit anything. And even a catapult-armed merchantman, you fling an old Hurricane up into the air, you've still got to worry about that thing. And again, you might lose the Hurricane, but if it forces the enemy to break off, again, net win because the missile misses. So while I would say, yes, in theory, having HS-293s earlier would cause more casualties in the convoys because, well, it would be a much more difficult weapon to deal with, overall, I think the fundamental problem would be that when they become available, you would have fewer launch platforms, therefore the loss of any one launch platform is considerably worse. And the Allies do have a range of options, as I said, both fighter interception based on perhaps submarine spottings or patrol aircraft spottings, and that could be on the way out or on the way back, plus, enhanced anti-aircraft defences on the convoys, catapult-armed merchantmen, escort carriers, etc. And by the time you've also developed a relatively decent-sized fleet of long-range bombers capable of carrying HS-293s out to a reasonable range, all of those Allied countermeasures will have been bedded in, and you've probably got jamming in place as well. So it would have caused more merchant casualties, but I don't think it would represent a problem that the Allies couldn't overcome in a, relatively speaking, swift time. And of course, it would also mean that if the Allies have worked out counters for the 293, then by the time you get to the historical deployment of the 293 against various invasion beaches, its effectiveness is going to be massively less. The Rogue Chief asks, with the 4th of July coming up, I have an American War of Independence related question. If the wreck off Flamborough Head is confirmed to be that of Bonhomme Richard, who legally has jurisdiction over it? It's in British territorial waters, but it's also a US naval war vessel and war grave. But it was sunk at a time when Britain didn't recognise the legitimacy of the United States, and when officially there wasn't a US Navy for it to belong to, so technically they might argue it's a pirate vessel in British waters, but it's also customarily accepted that anything continental is inherited into the USA. So who would control the wreck? It's actually a very interesting and complex legal question, because you're right, theoretically Bonhomme Richard sinks under a flag of a nation which isn't, at the time of the sinking, recognised as a thing. Obviously, the Treaty of Paris is in the early 1780s. Bonhomme Richard was sunk in 1779. But then again, the Declaration of Independence dates from several years before that, and the US traditionally sort of backdates itself to that period. And that's broadly accepted by everybody else. So I think in terms of Britain recognising that Bonhomme Richard is a American wreck, I think although by the letter of the law it's not, by the practice of the law they probably would say, yeah, fair enough, it's part of the US Navy's heritage. However, we run into another interesting issue. Generally, by the normal conventions of the sea, a shipwreck that was a warship that is up to 100 years old still belongs to the nation to whom it belonged when it sank. Over 100 years old, it's finders keepers. You found the wreck? Well, congratulations, you own it, unless it happens to lie in someone's territorial waters, in which case, obviously, they have a bit of a stake as well. Fortunately for this particular consideration, neither Britain nor the US actually agree with that interpretation. They both reckon that warship wrecks belong in perpetuity to their original owners, which is also the position of a few other countries. This, for example, leads to all sorts of fun negotiations, usually in court, when Spanish treasure galleons are occasionally fetched up in the Caribbean, because Spain tends to go, those are our ships, and incidentally, so is all the precious contents. The country or countries from which said precious contents were taken tend to go, actually, that belongs to us. And the people who found the wreck tend to go, oh, we think it belongs to us. And then, yeah, usually ends up in a 3 or 4 way legal dispute. But in this particular case, since the Bonhomme Richard, assuming that this wreck is Bonhomme Richard, is within UK territorial waters, but the US and the UK both have the same view of warship wrecks, it would essentially, at least as far as I can make out, be the case that the British government would acknowledge that it is a US Navy wreck, and thus the US Navy has a certain amount of say and stake in it. But since it lies within British territorial waters, the British government also has a say and stake in it. So therefore, any exploration would be in coordination between the UK government and the US Navy, or the US State Department, depending on who actually wants to talk to who. 22NF2 asks, what happened to the ship's bells of the World War I era HMS King George V and its World War II successor? Have any of the bells been preserved in a museum or similar institution, or have they been melted down or lost? I don't know for certain. However, in most cases, unless it's specifically been donated to somewhere, which ironically enough has actually happened to every other King George V class battleship's bell, or at least of the Second World War class. So Prince of Wales, Duke of York, Howe and Anson, we all know where their bells are, because they're on display in various places. Even Prince of Wales, which was sunk, but not King George V. I suspect, however, that if they're anywhere, they'll be at the Royal Navy Trophy Centre in Portsmouth, because, well, at least the second one was solid silver. That's not the kind of thing you just throw away. Or indeed sell on, because if it was sold on, then there would be some record of it. But yeah, I suspect they were both removed from their respective ships on scrapping and taken to the Trophy Centre. And I would put reasonable money on the fact that they're probably still there. Lord Druken asks, if the United States Navy hadn't been forced to severely downsize in the years after the Civil War due to Congressional financial recalcitrance, how do you think the Navy would have developed its fleets during the Ironclad Race? Personally, I don't see them trying to keep up with the latest and greatest of Europe, so I presume they'd concentrate on coast defence and a deep-sea navy that could defend its merchant fleet. Yeah, I can see the US Navy developing, I would say, perhaps 3 types of armoured ships. Firstly, you would see a slightly more seaworthy monitor type along the lines of what would eventually be the Puritan in the Amphitrite, etc., later in the 19th century. Essentially, all the advantages of a monitor for harbour defence with less of the sinking in any kind of significant weather while trying to transit between locations features of early monitors. And I suspect that will probably be the bulk of the US armoured fleet. But due to their relatively small size and the fact that you'd probably have specific monitors tied to specific port areas, I suspect the second tranche would be an evolution of something like the USS New Ironsides. Now, she did have her own problems with stability, but essentially a slightly more conventional-looking coastal ironclad. So not designed for long-distance deep-water operations, but much more like a ship than the armoured raft of the monitors. And you'd probably have maybe a squadron of these that was then able to transit much more rapidly and in even worse weathers between various US ports. These would also be useful for enforcing US wishes in somewhere like the Caribbean and for visiting up to Canada, places like that. And in times of war, this would essentially be your rapid reinforcement for whichever port or ports you thought was under threat. And then the third tranche, which I think they would develop, is that while most of Europe initially tried to do armoured frigates, but then mostly abandoned them, I suspect the US might have tried to do something with the armoured frigate, much in the same way as they obviously went with big frigates for the Constitution and so forth, and in a similar way to how they took the protected cruiser theory and upgraded it to the point that the Olympia was right on the border between protected and armoured cruiser. And I think they might do the same thing and have a largish armoured ship It's not going to be like an 8 to 10,000 tonner, the way that Warrior or something like that is going to be. And it perhaps won't be armoured against anything and everything that can be thrown at it, the way that ironclad battleships were supposed to be. But I think maybe they'd look into it and go, okay, what are the standard shots? So 32-pounders, believe it or not, still fairly common in the 1860s in smaller ships, and the shells that could be expected to be thrown at us from commerce raiders and commerce protectors, i.e. your sloops, corvettes, frigates, etc., your small stuff that would all later be agglomerated into being cruiser later on. And then maybe have a 4,000 to 6,000 ton armoured frigate that's relatively swift and armoured against those guns. And that would be your kind of your own trade protection and trade raiding ship, because it's slightly bigger, slightly faster, maybe faster, but at least slightly bigger and much better protected than your average commerce protection ship, so able to stand off against most of them unless they have a really big pivot gun or something. And even then, well, it will have many large guns and the other ship will only have the one. And I think they might run with that concept for a good long while, which might actually then dovetail into the development of the armoured cruiser later on. And next up we have, watching your videos, it does seem like the US Navy was almost singularly focused on making the 16-inch gun the primary weapon of their battleships prior to World War II, and possibly even prior to World War I. Was there a particular strategy that was driving the USA to want this kind of weapon? I wouldn't necessarily say prior to World War I, because the 16-inch gun only really comes about really as a practical thing during World War I. But in both cases, in terms of trying to get the Tennessees at least, and if not some of the earlier ships with 16-inch guns, and then later on the North Carolinas, South Dakotas and Iowas, a lot of it is initially driven by the perceived inadequacy of the 14-inch gun, and then subsequently held there by other perceived issues with an 18-inch gun. So allow me to explain a bit further. The US definitely does want a 16-inch gun a little bit sooner than it actually gets it in World War I, but they're held back by the Secretary of the Navy at the time, amongst other things. One of the drivers, weirdly enough, is congressional budgetary limits, which might sound a bit odd considering you're talking about a new big gun, but when you look at the various methods of thinking, which actually applies both for the upgrade from 12 to 14 and then 14 to 16, the US Navy realizes that when you've got ships armed with 12, 13, 14 guns, those ships necessarily are getting longer and longer because you're having to put more and more turrets on. And a bigger ship means you need more money, and then Congress starts screaming at you. So one of the ways around this that they identify is, well, if we have a bigger gun that fires a heavier shell, and therefore we can have a heavier broadside with fewer guns, then we don't need as long a ship. Therefore, the ship can be smaller, therefore it could potentially be cheaper, or at least of a similar cost, and therefore Congress might not scream at us as much. And you kind of see this when you're looking at, say, the immediately before World War I and World War I period, where other nations' battleships are growing by 20, 30, or 40 feet per class, whereas the US battleships going from the Wyomings to the New Yorks to the Nevadas and then to the Pennsylvanias, usually you're only talking 10 to 15 feet, if that, even though the ships are obviously getting substantially more capable in each turn. But once you've got ships armed with 12, 14-inch guns, your only real alternatives at that point are to go much bigger and add a fifth triple turret, which is going to be very expensive, or to upgrade to 16-inch guns, which gets you a nastier broadside without, again, much, if any, increase in overall dimensions and size. You know, look at the overall size of the Tennessees versus the overall size of the Colorados. They're actually very, very similar. And then once they've got to the 16-inch gun, when they're looking at the Lexingtons and the South Dakotas, etc., they do start considering, do we go to the 18-inch gun? But they eventually conclude that given the amount of armour that people are realistically going to be putting on ships at that point and in the immediate future, with perhaps not knowing quite what the N3 was going to be carrying, they essentially conclude that at a reasonable battle range that they expect to fight at, the 16-inch shell can probably do a decent job of penetration against pretty much anything they'll come across, and is faster loading, and you can have more of them as compared to 18-inch guns, which will load slower and you've got fewer shots, so they don't think it's really worth it. They'd rather have a dozen 16-inch as opposed to 9 18-inch. And that's actually pretty much the same logic that you get with the World War II period, when they're looking at the Iowa and the Montana designs. They do consider 18-inch guns, but again, they conclude, well, having more guns is probably, generally speaking, they think is a better option, given that the penetration characteristics of the 16-inch, particularly the 16-inch 50, is pretty close to a theoretical 18-inch that they could produce. So essentially, again, they reckon they can penetrate most armor at most ranges using a gun that has marginally less penetration but a somewhat higher rate of fire and more chances to hit because you have more guns on a given hull. So that's the reason where they kind of stay with a 16-inch gun once they've got it. But then also fast forward to World War II, you have a similar situation of at the start of it, or just before, with the North Carolinas, where they're designed with a 14-inch gun in place in compliance with the treaties, but then as soon as those treaty systems look like they're collapsing, they're just going, okay, well, we're back to the 16-inch because that's kind of our happy place to be. It's their ideal gun because they reckon they can just about fit it on a 35,000-ton hull and get a balanced ship, although you do end up with a few compromises with the South Dakotas, obviously. But they reckon it reaches out pretty far. It's got a rate of fire that's not really any different from a 14 or a 15-inch gun, but it hits harder, and you get a decent amount of them on the hulls that they're building. Dr. Feelgood asks, was there ever any thought given to upgunning the Tennessee class to 16-inch twins after the collapse of the treaty system, or was that more trouble than it was worth even to get 2 more Colorado equivalents? Despite the relative similarities between the Tennessees and the Colorados, and indeed such temptation might well have been there had there not been a Washington Treaty, by the time of the treaty system's collapse in the mid-1930s, the US was already moving over to fast battleships, and their preservation plans and refit plans in some ways mirrored the Royal Navy. So the Royal Navy planned on modernising Hood, Renown, Repulse and some of the Queen Elizabeths to essentially tide them over while they outright replaced the fleet with fast battleships, and then they would be the last to go. Likewise, in the US, they planned to use the North Carolinas to replace the oldest of their ships, so the non-standard battleships, and then the South Dakotas would be the replacements for the first of the standards. Then, as time went on, the other standards would all be gradually replaced. But what they termed the Big Five, the 3 Colorados and the 2 Tennessees, they would undergo a modernization, probably not quite as extensive, but very similar in principle to that the British did, essentially to give them somewhat modern ships to bulk out the fast battleship fleet while the rest of the fast battleships were built. However, this was only planned really to extend those ships' service lives by 5 to 10 years at the very most. And ultimately, the Tennessees were slow, the same as the Colorados. So their use in the battle line would only be in case of emergency if a war happens and we need a battle line and we only have the first few of our fast capital ships. Now, as it turns out, almost all those requirements were ticked by the Second World War, except for the fact that the US turned out not to actually need a battle line immediately after the war started. But at the end of the day, they were looking across the pond to their potential opponents, and, well, what were the Japanese likely to field? Well, their oldest battle line components would be the Congos, the Fusos, and the Isseis. They all have 14-inch guns and inferior protection to the Tennessees, so the Tennessees would do fine in that circumstance. They weren't expecting the Tennessees to have to fight the Nagatos or whatever they thought the Japanese were building after that. That would be the job for the Colorados and the new fast battleships. So compared with the cost and time of ripping out all the 14-inch guns, replacing all the hoists and everything with bigger ones to deal with 16-inch, and building a bunch of 16-inch twins to stick on them. It just wasn't worth it compared to the threats that they thought they were going to face in the intervening period before they'd be scrapping them anyway. Alex Moskovitz asks, "Hi Drac, I have some questions about pilots in the era of steam and steel. Firstly, did ships generally use pilots when navigating around their home port or ports that they were very familiar with? 2, if so, when using pilots around naval bases, were pilots typically members of the Navy or private citizens? And 3, how were pilots, either at home or abroad, integrated into a ship's command structure? 4, did submarines ever use pilots?" In order, yes, ships generally, pretty much exclusively, will use pilots even if they're going through their home port or a port that the ship is familiar with, because just because the ship is in its home port, it doesn't necessarily mean that the captain or the ship's navigating officer has a particularly great amount of experience with that port. And ultimately, there's also kind of a liability issue involved. A harbour pilot will always know the area better than the ship's crew, even if the crew are relatively familiar with that area. There's a reason they exist. When you're talking about a pilot in a naval base, are they part of the Navy or private citizens? Typically, it will still be a private citizen. Now, that might be just a private harbour pilot, it might be a civilian government employee, or it might be occasionally a Navy pilot. It really depends on, obviously, the Navy in question, but also where exactly are they going, because obviously most naval bases are in areas that also contain civilian ports, like Portsmouth in the UK, for example, at which point the approaches are exactly the same. So a civilian pilot can guide you just as well as a Navy pilot can. But if you're talking about particularly sensitive areas or an area that is almost entirely or exclusively a naval base, where there may not be enough civilian traffic to justify a civilian pilot, they might not be able to make a living there, then you might have a Navy pilot. Of course, as time has gone on past the period the channel covers, some areas or some kinds of ships that may be a bit more sensitive might have a higher number of places that they go where there is a specific Navy pilot. But obviously, again, I don't know as much about that as pre-1950 stuff. In terms of how were pilots integrated into the ship's command structure, well, the pilot essentially takes over giving navigational direction to the ship, or takes over navigation directly, although the captain is still the ultimate authority on the ship, so the captain can override the pilot if he sees fit, although in most circumstances where that's been tried, it usually doesn't end very well for the captain, because he usually ends up grounding the ship. Very occasionally, pilots have been known to make errors that the captain has corrected, but it's far more common that a captain trying to correct a pilot is usually actually in the wrong. And do submarines ever use pilots, or did submarines ever use pilots? Yes. Although obviously if they're making a sneaky approach or whatever, they don't necessarily always have to. But generally speaking, if a submarine is coming in on the surface in peacetime, most of the time they'd be expected to have a pilot on board. But as I said, occasionally they'll come in sneakily or use their very small size to justify not needing one. But it'd be a brave captain indeed who goes into a port, in peacetime at least, and goes, yeah, you know what, I'm not going to take a pilot, I'm just going to do it all by myself. Because that means, well, if anything goes wrong, yeah, that's all on you. And you've got to explain why you thought you could do it without a pilot, when clearly you needed one. Kern van Krooning asks, are there any naval topics pre-1950 that you've discovered are politically highly sensitive to this day, and how do you deal with them? There are a few. I would put them into one of three categories: unsurprising, somewhat surprising, and eye roll. So in reverse order, eye roll would be, heaven help us, there are some people nowadays, I suppose they've always been there, but perhaps with the internet they're getting louder and louder voices, who seem weirdly determined to defend Nazi Germany for some bizarre reason. And I'm not talking here about, people who think Bismarck was the greatest thing since sliced bread and also invented sliced bread. I'm talking about people who legitimately think that somehow the Nazi government was hard done by everybody else. And, you know, I mean, you get things like when there's even a tangential mention of something like the scuttling of the French fleet at Toulon. I haven't covered it specifically in video yet, but I have mentioned that and the obviously Operation Torch and things like that. And you get some really bizarre things like people saying, oh, well, you know, the Germans invading Vichy France wasn't Germany breaking their word again. It was entirely justified because France was breaking the terms of the treaty because French North Africa surrendered. And I'm sitting there going, no. What you've done is you've swallowed Nazi propaganda, literally hook, line, and sinker. You know, grow a brainstem, actually look at the history for a change, and realise that the German invasion and occupation of Vichy France started literally within 48 hours of Operation Torch. You know, the French, even the ones who were the first to give in, most of the French around, Casablanca and stuff, were still fighting when the Germans had already rolled in to mainland France. And yes, the surrender by Admiral Darlan and everything does happen in relatively short order, but the German plans and gathering of forces for the invasion of Vichy France predate that by a quite considerable amount, and the German panzers are already rolling into Vichy France before French North Africa has fallen. You know, so unless there's some Primaris psychers in Nazi Germany, in which case, how did they lose? They were basically using it as an excuse. They were not legitimately counter-invading Vichy France because they thought it was collaborating. Now, so that's the kind of the eye roll of, okay, you clearly are a few fries short of a Happy Meal there. Then you have the surprising. Now, for that, I would actually, believe it or not, I would put Meuse el-Kebir under this heading. Not because I'm surprised that Meuse el-Kebir is a contentious topic. That's kind of a given. You know, the minute you research Meuse el-Kebir, you realise there's going to be a fair number of French people who either have a very different view of how it all went down, and or, regardless of how they think it went down, might still hold something of a grudge, which is understandable in the abstract. However, weirdly, almost all the French people that I've had some kind of correspondence with who object in some way, shape or form to my interpretation of what happened at Meuse el-Kebir and whose fault it was, they might have been relatively strong in their views, but they've been also relatively polite and open to discussion. And, the line of reasoning has not been, well, you silly Englishman, you clearly know nothing. It's been, well, okay, you say this, but how can you say this? Are you not aware of this? Or what about this? Did you consider this? They're kind of, because they have information and they're thinking, oh, well, maybe the English guy didn't take into consideration these and these factors, and surely if he's aware of these factors, he will change his mind. And some of the things they pointed out, I've not been aware of. Now, to be fair, at the same time, those things haven't really changed the bulk of where I stand on Meuse el-Kebir, but it's interesting to find. And other things where they're like, well, what about this? I'm like, well, yeah, I have taken this into account, but I have interpreted it differently. Now, even if they agree to disagree, the majority of French people who I've discussed this with have at least been, okay, no, I can see how you would interpret it that way. I still disagree with you interpreting it that way, but fair enough, cultural views. Which is fair, this is how civilized people disagree over things. Admittedly, there's a very, very small hardcore who are just like, if you don't denounce Churchill as, a murderer who drinks French children's blood for breakfast every morning, you are therefore clearly evil. But you get those kind of lunatics in every nation, so that they exist in France is not exactly surprising and not a particular reflection on Meuse el-Kebir or the French. No, the surprising thing about Meuse el-Kebir is some of the most vehement, most aggressive, and most ill-mannered people when it comes to dealing with the situation aren't French. The ones who are like absolutely rabid and essentially unreasonable tend to be people who have no connection. They're not French or British. They're people who have no real, if you like, stake in this. But they've taken a side and gone way off the deep end to extremes, which, on the one hand, it does make them easy to ignore because they're quite clearly frothing at the mouth lunatics, but it is also sometimes quite funny because you get them making somewhat absurd statements like, the only correct interpretation or version of what happened at Mers el-Kabir is the French version. And I'm like, well, one, I'm sorry, but there are two sides to Mers el-Kabir. So just declaring ad hoc that we should only believe the French version and not take into account anything that the Royal Navy or the British government had to say about it is absurd from a historian's perspective. But also, what is the French version of Mers el-Kabir? Because shockingly enough, there isn't a single unified version of the French version of Mers el-Kabir, in much the same way as there isn't a unified British version of what happened at Mers el-Kabir and should it have happened and who was responsible, more or less, etc., etc. Believe it or not, the French people are not a monolith hive mind. There are differing opinions amongst French historians as to who and what is responsible for Mers el-Kabir and to what extent. Now, obviously, the majority of French historians are, shockingly, somewhat more sympathetic to the French side of things, but there is still a huge degree of nuance. So, saying that, the French version of Mers el-Kabir is the only correct one is like saying the Americans' favourite football team is the only correct one. And it's like, okay, sure, you are aware how many football teams there are in the States. And then we get to the ones that aren't very surprising in terms of political sensitivities these days, which is why you've had this picture in the background the entire time. And that's things like the slave trade. Because, oh boy, there's a lot of misinformation going on about the slave trade and the Royal Navy's attempts to stop the slave trade and anything to do with the slave trade, really. And, if you try and discuss it at all, you'll literally have people, everything from it was entirely justified to you are not black and therefore you cannot speak about it, and everything in between. That bit, that's really, really not surprising at all. Because, well, people tend to be idiots when it comes to highly politically sensitive subjects, and then they tend to drift to the extremes. So, now that I've classified those three things, how do I deal with it? Well, with the eye roll stuff, I just carry on. Frankly, I don't care if there's a handful of lunatics out there who want to glorify the Third Reich. They're perfectly happy to do that. I would just refer them to, well, any one of my grandfather's generation who tended to throw large amounts of explosives at the last lot of people who tried to glorify the Third Reich. Then you have the surprising things like Mers el-Kabir, and in those cases, if something turns out to be surprisingly contentious, my approach to that is, well, I took an approach that, as far as I was concerned, looked through all the appropriate sources and everything, and if other people have a significantly different opinion, either based on new sources or radically different interpretation of existing sources, then I'm happy to have a discussion with them and perhaps do a follow-up. So I know there is a French chap out there who covers some naval history, and at some point he wants to have a whole discussion with me about Mers el-Kabir, and I'm perfectly open to that. If there's a French naval historian out there who wants to sit down and have a nice reasoned discussion about, well, I disagree with you, Drac, on your interpretation of Mers el-Kabir, and this is why, and we can have a nice rational debate about it that everyone can listen to and form their own opinions, that's perfectly fine. And if enough of those people put up new information that, as far as I can tell, seems to actually radically change things, then of course I can do an update of myself and say, well, in light of new information, perhaps this, and this, which is fine. This is how history progresses. When it comes to the stuff that is obviously going to be a political hot rail or live wire from the beginning, then, well, if it's going to be super contentious, I'm just sort of looking and go, well, I could cover it, but there's so much other interesting stuff that doesn't involve a headache that I could cover. But also, I kind of have it in the back of my mind of I probably still should cover this for fairness' sake. And in those cases, it's just a case of, well, not do good research, because I'm hopefully doing good research already. It's a case of absolutely dot every T, cross every I, and try and preempt some of the most common arguments. Be even more pernickety and rivet counting than normal. So, for example, at some point I do actually want to do a much more expanded video on the Royal Navy's efforts to stamp out the slave trade in the early 19th century, much beyond the sort of fairly abbreviated 15-minute-ish video I did very early in the channel's history. But because if you drill really deep down into it to cover off a lot of these points, you end up essentially, neck deep in the situation. I'm probably going to identify a specific ship or individual's career, probably Captain Denman's career, and then do a video where we look at the suppression of the slave trade in the Atlantic through the lens of Captain Denman and his career, rather than trying to address the entire thing in one video. And to be fair, Denman's career does cover a good chunk of it, and has some very amusing sections as well, believe it or not, including some of the finest British rules lawyering I've ever seen. And then finally for this week, Brian Stevens asks, in the early part of the Age of Sail, it seems that there were several navies competing in size and power. The English, Dutch, French, Portuguese, Spanish, etc., etc. Everyone had overseas imperial holdings, and it would seem to me absolutely vital to have a strong enough navy to protect them. And it's not like all these holdings were lost. How is it then, by 1800, that the British and the French are the only ones remaining as real navies? Well, it's a mixture of things. By 1800, the Spanish Navy is still quite a formidable and going concern. There's a reason the French wanted to get them on side after all. But by the early 19th century, you've got Britain initially taking the lead in the Industrial Revolution, combined with the fact that Britain, as an island nation, can emphasize a greater proportion of its national resources into a navy as opposed to an army, which all the European land-based powers have to maintain an army as well. So those two combined have given them a bit of an advantage, plus obviously success in various wars in the 1700s has allowed them to take some fairly choice colonial holdings. And that means you've got a combination of industry, which allows them to produce ships, the island status, meaning that, as I said, they can put more of their resources into building ships, and they have a pretty hefty empire which is producing, for them at least, a lot of value, which they can then pour money into building even more ships. The French have essentially the biggest European economy in terms of how much money does their European land holdings produce. And they also have a reasonable size overseas empire, which is also obviously providing with trade. They've got plenty of people as well. And all of that combines into the fact that although they do have to maintain a fairly large land army, they also have enough money to invest in a fairly large navy. And so obviously there's France. The Spanish are, to be entirely fair, mostly running off of the let's drain South America of everything valuable and shiny we can possibly find method of empire building, which is eventually, after several centuries, beginning to run out, and the locals down in South America are beginning to get a little bit more resentful than they usually are about the whole situation, which is kind of why the Spanish Empire is beginning to wind down a little bit, and will wind down very dramatically over the 19th century. But those three nations are essentially fairly wealthy, have a significant degree of overseas territory, which is in turn is helping to fund the wealth in various forms, and therefore they have the motivation to protect that wealth. As far as the Portuguese are concerned, the Portuguese have been invaded several times by the Spanish, and although they initially had a number of rather interesting holdings overseas. Some of the trade concerns they had, such as with the Japanese, they've lost out to over time, in that case to the Dutch. Some of their other colonies, they've lost to other powers who've taken them off of them, either directly or indirectly, such as when they were occupied by Spain, someone going, oh, well, these are now Spanish colonies, we're at war with Spain, we'll have those back. Eventually, when Portugal gets its independence back, it's like, well, sorry, we took them off of Spain when they were Spain's, and no, we're not giving them back to you now. And some of the... So they're forced out of, and they're actively forced out of some as well, like some of their holdings in India. So essentially, the start of their overseas empire, they've lost a decent chunk of it, and other elements of their empire weren't based so much on physically controlling the area as being the only ones who could actually get there, like a lot of the early spice trade. But then once everyone else gets there, their exclusivity kind of goes away. And combined with the fact they have a relatively small land mass that doesn't have a huge economic base in and of itself on the European continent, plus the ever-present threat of the Spanish going, Iberian Union, Mark 3, 4, 5, or 6, then that's why their navy has kind of declined a little bit compared to everybody else's. I mean, it's still there, but it's just not top tier anymore. The Dutch, who are pretty much the only other really major going concern in terms of international navies, because Italy and Germany don't exist at this point, they're a bunch of city-states, but the Dutch have been on the losing side of a few different wars. They've also, like Portugal, been invaded a few times, although not quite as many in the classic Age of Sail. They've certainly been under threat of invasion multiple times. And in some way similar to the Portuguese, the Dutch East India Company has either lost out some of its holdings to Britain and or France. They've also lost out on some of the exclusive trade routes they used to have. And there have been a few economic issues back in the Netherlands as well. And ultimately, of all those powers, the Dutch have the smallest land area. So they physically can't produce as much on their land in Europe, which complicates things. So, yeah, Portugal and the Netherlands have essentially had their overseas holdings reduced to a point where, yes, they're earning money from them, but they're not earning anywhere near as much money as the much larger territorial holdings of France, Britain, and Spain, which in turn means that they can't afford to produce as many warships. They don't have as much incentive to produce huge numbers of warships. And then the minute that balance starts to, not favour them and favours the others, then if they end up picking the wrong side of a war that involves one of the big powers, then they get their fleet completely rolled and have to start from scratch, which helps even less. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. And next week is, of course, the Patreon Drydock. So look forward to that, hopefully. At least if you need a good sleep.